If you give a person flour and water, they can survive on it for a while. But if they bake bread, they can live off of it indefinitely. Bread is the most traditional food consumed globally, and although there is no written history of its origins, we figure it's about 6,000 years old. All bread was made using the sourdough technique until yeast became readily available in the 1890s. I enjoy cooking and baking, but found the idea of making bread quite daunting. In reality, bread is relatively simple to make and difficult to mess up. First, I inoculate a bowl of flour and water with the sourdough starter and let it sit for a few hours until it becomes bubbly. I add a little salt, some flour, and mix until a dough ball forms, and then knead for about 10 minutes. I can actually feel the texture of the dough change when it is properly mixed. I let the dough ball rest and rise for several hours, knead again for 5 minutes, and shape into loaves. I like to cook in cast iron, and I put my loaves in there and let them rest and rise again. The cooking vessel will change the amount of crust and the density of the bread. The time to rest and rise varies depending on the temperature and humidity of the room. A longer rise often means more sour flavor and a longer cook time. I cook bread for about an hour to an hour and a half at 350 until it is caramel colored on top. Once I got the hang of making bread, I began to experiment with flavors and textures. I used different flours, I had herbs, cheese, or even dried fruit and veggies. You can have lots of fun experimenting with flavors, rise times, and even cooking vessels to make bread just the way you want it. No two loaves turn out the same. You can also make pancakes, bagels, pizza crust, and all sorts of other baked goods using a sourdough starter. It takes time and practice to perfect your sourdough technique. There is a true art to making sourdough. My starter is a living community of microbes made up of yeasts and lactic acid bacteria, which symbiotically ferment the carbohydrates in flour. It lives on my counter, and if I'm not making bread regularly, I have to feed it flour and water. If I want to stop making bread, I put it in the fridge where it will go dormant. I call my starter Verla, and she is over 100 years old. And unlike some starters, she is hardy and doesn't seem to mind changes in her environment, or if I forget to feed her for several days. I got Verla from a friend, who got her from a friend, and I have passed her on to several people. Almost any pulverized grain mixed with water will start to bubble after a few days and can become a starter. Starters are all different because the bacteria and yeast originate from the flour and the surrounding environment. The frequency and amount fed to a starter and its age can affect its microbiome. Scientists are now studying the science of starters and trying to understand them better. Bread technology has been around for thousands of years, but we don't know much about the starter. There are even a few public science experiments where home bakers can send in samples of their starter and record observations they make while baking. During the rest and rise time of bread making, the lactic acid bacteria ferment the carbohydrates in the flour, producing acids which are responsible for the sour taste of sourdough. The yeast ferment the carbohydrates and produce carbon dioxide, which is trapped in the dough and makes bubbles, causing the dough to rise. There are several health benefits to consuming fermented foods, and sourdough is no exception. During sourdough fermentation, healthy enzymes, organic acids, polysaccharides, and antimicrobial compounds are produced. Fermentation lowers the glycemic index of the bread, as well as levels of phytic acid. Lower levels of phytic acid means that our guts have an increased ability to absorb vitamins, minerals, and amino acids. The fermentation process also breaks down gluten. A long fermented sourdough can even be eaten by individuals with gluten allergies or intolerances. Sourdough in general is easier to digest than yeast breads because of the breakdown of carbohydrates and proteins that occurs during fermentation. Sourdough has been found to decrease the risks of some cancers, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and obesity. As a society, we are becoming more savvy about what we are putting in our bodies. Have a look at the 30-plus ingredients on many commercially sold breads, and you can understand why it has become trendy to buy bread at a farmer's market or to make it at home. Sourdough has 3 simple ingredients: flour, water, and a little salt. Yeast breads mold relatively quickly. In sourdough, the fermentation process produces several acids and hydrogen peroxide. These are natural preservers and inhibit the growth of foodborne pathogens. You would have to leave sourdough on the counter for several weeks before it would go bad. Another benefit to making bread at home is the savings. Even using high-end organic flour and taking into account the gas my oven uses and the lights in my kitchen, I figure it costs me less than 40 cents to make a loaf of bread. Compare this to the $7 to $12 I've paid for a loaf of sourdough at my local bakery or farmer's market. But the best thing about sourdough is eating it. The fermentation process improves the taste and texture of the bread. Nothing is more satisfying or tastes better than a fresh slice of sourdough that you made yourself.